The hardest part of planning this workshop was really figuring out what to name it. In the invite email you all got, we ended up calling it Sustainable Transportation. But for the sake of fewer syllables, I'm going to say mobility tonight, which is still a little bit of a mouthful, but definitely less. And what I mean by that is walking, biking, and public transit. Essentially, the forms of sustainable transportation that get you around your neighborhood in a way that helps you get to know your community. Because when you're walking, biking, or on the bus with your neighbors, it's an implicit way of building community in a way that you can't do in a private vehicle, even if it's an EV. So that's roughly what I mean, but hopefully you'll get a better sense and clarity on that term as I keep speaking tonight. So with that said, why is mobility justice important? I like this graphic because it says that giving everyone the same tools doesn't always work. We need different options that work for different people. Of course, the limitation of this graphic is that everyone still has some version of a bike. And what we're advocating for here is bigger. We want people to have the option to walk, to bike, to roll, to take transit, to roller skate, however it is that they want to move around public space. And our priority is making sure that they get to use public space with dignity. Mobility justice is also important because not everyone has equal access to safe, comfortable mobility. Traffic violence affects communities of color, low-income communities, and people with disabilities disproportionately. So Black and Indigenous people are killed in traffic violence at much higher rates than people of other races. So are low-income people as compared to people of higher incomes. And a big part of that also, both with race and with class, is about the neighborhoods that we live in and the investment that they've seen historically and in present day. I also want to pause and bring this back to the climate crisis because I know that's something we all care deeply about. As I said earlier, what I really care about is ways that we can materially improve people's lives while also doing right by the planet. So why I work on mobility is because I think it's a useful framework both for thinking about mitigation and adaptation. When we're walking and biking, we feel the impacts of heat, flooding, and air pollution, and the changes that we need to make so that we have better mobility will redesign our streets to be better for those things too. And shifting modes away from private vehicles is important for reducing emissions, but when we don't have our streets and public spaces dominated by parking and driving lanes, we free up space for so many other things like housing, shops, recreation, parks. The possibilities are really endless. And CCAN's next big goal is lowering transportation emissions by reducing vehicle miles traveled. And you can do that, and you should be a part of that, and making that happen in Virginia and in your own community. So what I want to focus on tonight is how we can accomplish that sort of mode shift. What are the policies and infrastructure that we need to make, to not only make it possible for people to use other modes, but also to make safe and inviting experiences out of using public space so that people actively want to choose walking or biking or transit. I also want to quickly mention that there are a bunch of really distracting debates that happen within this space that if folks have questions about, we can discuss it in the second half of the session. But the goal of tonight is not to complain about bicyclists or other road users, but again, to ask how we can make it possible for people, for everyone to use their preferred mode of transportation safely and comfortably. So now that we know why we're here, let's finally start talking about what makes a community mobility friendly. I like to think about it in terms of these 6 elements. So safety, access, comfort, connected networks, destinations, and activity. First, safety. Safety can mean different things to different people, but there are a few things that we always try to have, like clear signage and markers, smooth and well-lit surfaces, and buffers from moving traffic. Access is also essential. Moving beyond the bare minimum of ADA compliance, it's important to consider barriers to bad drainage, snow pileup, excess heat, vehicles blocking the crosswalk or sidewalk, and all of the other barriers that make it difficult to navigate walking networks, especially if you're using a mobility device like a wheelchair. Comfort is what determines whether someone wants to spend time in public space, walking, biking, or waiting for transit. Because again, we can't really expect people to shift modes and do what we think is more sustainable unless we're making that option inviting and something that they want to do. So having public spaces where people can rest and maintaining the public realm helps determine whether people want to shift modes. Now, I like to say that public transit is really the middle leg of a walking or a biking journey. In order to get to transit, you need to walk or to bike there, or you could drive there, but we're really trying to discourage that. So let's not even pretend that's an option. But if you have to walk or bike there, that means that sidewalk or bike network should be complete. Transit should be frequent, reliable, convenient, affordable, and there should be crosswalks and bike parking as close to the bus stop as possible. I think any of us who have taken the bus frequently enough really know the experience of being right across the street, seeing the bus pull up, and having to make the determination of whether you are going to run to the closest crosswalk, cross there, and then run all the way back and know that you're going to miss the bus in that much time, or whether you're going to play a little game of Frogger and run through traffic to get to the bus as quickly as possible before it pulls out. And that's why having a crosswalk as close to that bus stop as possible really makes a huge difference in terms of safety and people's ability to take public transit. And part of what makes driving appealing is that if you're not living in a walkable community, driving is the only reasonable way to get to places you want to go. So having a diversity of destinations that appeal to everyone and that you can get to by walking or biking or transit is essential. These destinations can be informal or formal, they can be more permanent, or they can be temporary pop-ups as communities try to change their land use and try to bring in more activity. But having those kinds of destinations is really what gets people out walking and biking to the places they want to get to. And last, and personally my favorite, is activity. The reason that I love walking is that when I'm driving and I see something interesting going on, I can't really just stop my car in the middle of traffic or reverse to go back and check out what was going on. At least I can't do that safely. But when I'm walking, I really get to be my own boss. So if I see someone playing music and I just want to stop and listen for a while, I can do that. If I see a crowd gathering and I want to know what they're up to, I can go and be nosy. If I see a box on the sidewalk with a pile of books, I can peruse through that if I want to. So having activity of different levels, having that kind of chaos that you might think is a bad thing is actually what draws people out, what gets them excited to be in their neighborhoods and to spend time outside. And that's something that makes walking, that makes biking and other forms of mobility so much more appealing than being stuck in your car. Okay, so that is the picture that I wanted to paint of the elements that we want to have. Now let's talk about the infrastructure and the policies that make that possible. I am going to try to the extent possible to not make this wonky. Maybe some of you like the little urban planning wonkiness. I'm going to try to avoid it, but I know there's going to be some places that it's inevitable, so bear with me. I've broken this section up into the roadway, crossings, sidewalks, bike lanes, and streetscape elements. I'm going to talk about the infrastructure and the policies that we want for each of those things. And again, this is the spot where I would like for you all to be thinking about where you see and don't see these elements in your own communities, because as you're advocating for change, these are the kind of levers that you want to pull to make change in your own community. So let's start with roadways. The speed a vehicle is traveling at makes a massive difference for pedestrian or bicyclist survival. So if a car is driving at 40 miles per hour and it hits a pedestrian, the chance of that pedestrian being killed or severely injured is 77%, according to this data. If you half that speed to 20 miles per hour, that likelihood of fatality or of severe injury goes down to 18%. So still not zero, but much smaller than the 77% it was at 40 miles per hour. The problem is that that data is not actually as accurate as the current situation. In the US, cars keep getting bigger with worse sightlines, and especially for young children, that's extremely dangerous. I'll also say that while EVs are better than gas guzzling cars in many ways, they're also heavier because they have those heavy batteries, and so they're more dangerous to get hit by. And that's just another reason that switching to electric can't be our only solution. We have to talk about mode shift, and we have to talk about how to make it safer and more inviting for people to walk, to bike, to use mass transit. So we need to slow speeds, and we can do that through a few different policy levers that communities can implement to reduce their speeds. There are a few different kinds of speed limits that can be set, either municipality-wide or for specific areas, including schools and areas where you may have a lot of seniors. There's also the Complete Streets policy, which is an approach to redesign streets so that all road users can use the road safely. And it's thinking not just in terms of a policy framework, but also specific road design changes. And we can talk more about Complete Streets again in the discussion if folks are interested in learning more about that. But really, and as Complete Streets is showing in its approach, the most impactful way to slow speeds is by changing street design, including those cars outside my window that will keep honking. I apologize for the background noise. If we design streets so that drivers are inclined to slow down and pay more attention, that really works. So think about how differently you drive on a street that's narrow with trees and parked cars on either side that feels more like you have to pay attention as you're moving your own vehicle through, versus on a road that feels like a highway with no visual stimuli and distractions. So on a main street, the lane widths should not be more than about 10 feet wide, and striping, so painting fog lines, those white lines at the edge of a road, painting bike lanes, designated bus lanes, all of those things are ways to very quickly and cheaply narrow a lane width. And even narrowing a lane width from 11 to 10 feet can slow speeds by as much as 7 miles per hour. So that's pretty dramatic for a very small change that most people probably wouldn't notice, and people who are against change probably wouldn't complain about. I think that when we talk about climate change, it's much more useful to paint a hopeful vision of what we do want, instead of painting an apocalyptic vision of what will happen if we don't do anything. And I think the same is true of talking about mobility and talking about the kinds of changes that we want in our streetscapes. Really what we're doing is not narrowing lanes and taking space away from drivers, but giving public space back to people to use for other uses. So that means that when we narrow a lane width enough so that a driver can still go through, but just more safely, you're also creating space for people to safely bike, to have outdoor seating and things that we've come to really love in the last few years, to have murals, to have all kinds of different informal space. Okay, let's talk about crossings. So here's where we get to do a little bit of the wonkiness, and I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. But I find that the more I pay attention to this kind of stuff, the more I enjoy like the nerdiness of walking and being stuck at a crosswalk and thinking about timings and all of that. So maybe you're like me and you'll enjoy this too. But very quickly, what we want with a signalized crossing is to have good timing, so ample timing for people of all abilities to be able to cross the street safely, to have that signal, the walk signal, come frequently enough that people don't risk it because they get impatient from waiting at the crosswalk for too long, to have automatic recall so that you don't have to be in charge of pushing a button and try to figure out if someone who got to the intersection before you did already push that button. It should just be happening automatically the same way that it does for driving lanes. Phasing is sort of, sometimes it's better to have all of the pedestrians go at once in a scramble and then have timings for vehicle traffic to move. And sometimes it's better to have pedestrians moving with the traffic in either direction. Again, so if that's something that people are interested in talking about more, I'm happy to do that. But for now, that's kind of the basic lingo that I want you to know. And pedestrian countdown signals are also so great, just that people can be their own judge about how much time it's going to take them to cross that street and whether they have enough time. Leading pedestrian intervals and leading bike intervals are an example of the kind of nerdy thing that I love. It's essentially when you have a turning lane for moving vehicle traffic that gets a green light at the same time that pedestrians or bicyclists get a light for them to be able to move, what tends to happen is that cars will start moving and turning, and that's blocking off the bike lane and the crosswalk, which means that pedestrians then wait or bicyclists wait, and then by the time cars are done turning, the walk sign is almost over and they don't have enough time to walk. If you have a leading pedestrian interval or a leading bike interval, their light turns green before the turning lane's light turns green, which gives them a head start. And what that does is make it so that pedestrians and bicyclists start moving first, and by the time that they're done, then the vehicles that are turning can go through much more quickly, because you can move a vehicle much faster than you can move a person. So that is the correct order to have things in my opinion. Refuge islands are where if you have a long crossing, having a spot in between where people can wait so that if they get stuck in the middle of a crosswalk towards the end of a walk signal, they have a place to wait safely. And bike boxes, I'll show an image of a little ahead, but give added visibility and advantage to bicyclists. And last, having accessible pedestrian signals are so important. That's where you have signals that have Braille in them so that they're readable, but also have audible and visual cues, so that, and tactile cues as well, so that people with low visibility know when it's time for them to cross. Also having those little bumpy things that you see on the ground, that helps orient people with visual disabilities to where the crosswalk is and point them in the right direction. So those things are really important to have at crossings. And then I'll go faster with this one. With the unsignalized crossings, just having the kinds of things that make a crosswalk visible when it doesn't have a designated light for it, super important. Having the same accessibility features as a signalized crossing is also important. And then having things to slow drivers down, like tight turning radii, which I will talk about in a little bit, and raised crosswalks, which I will also talk about, that just give a little bit more visibility to pedestrians. Daylighting is another one of my really favorite things. It's so simple. What happens at a lot of crosswalks is you have cars parked up right up to the crosswalk, and that makes it so that if a car is approaching, that driver can't see all of the people who are right behind those cars waiting to cross. So visibility is pretty low. If you get rid of just one parking spot and set parking back even 10 feet, so not even a full parking spot, you increase visibility so much more. And it makes a huge difference safety-wise. And I'm sure that the next time you're at a crosswalk and you're doing that little thing of peeking around a car, you will think about daylighting. Such a simple thing that we can do to make our crossings that much safer. Okay, I promised I would talk about curb radii. Again, a really simple thing. When you have a wide curb and you're driving, you don't really have to slow down to make that turn, which also means that you're not really stopping enough to pay attention to who may be coming and trying to cross that crosswalk. So just bumping out a curb to get closer to a 90-degree angle forces drivers to slow down enough that they, one, are slowing down so their speeds are slower, which we talked about why that was so important, but also they are forced to kind of look around and pay more attention to people who might be crossing. So it's a double safety win. And again, I think accessibility is really at the heart of a lot of the conversations we have about mobility, because if we can design communities that work for people with disabilities, they work so much better for all of us too. Detectable warning strips are those bumpy things that I talked about on the ground. They're so important. And as are audible signals. I also think that raised crossings are something that we need to be thinking about more with climate change as we have more flooding and more puddling at a crosswalk. So many of us know the experience of having to leap over and still getting our shoes and socks wet. If we have the crosswalk raised up, you don't have that space to have a puddle. So again, something that makes the connections much easier for people with disabilities, but also better for everyone else. Lack of parking at destinations. Oh, we will talk about that. Don't worry, Kate, it's coming. Bike boxes, again, I already kind of talked about this, but it just helps with visibility at an intersection for bicyclists, gives them an easier way to turn left and prevents a lot of common collisions. Likewise, protected intersections help bicyclists not have to interact with moving vehicles as they're trying to make turns. So it just is another simple safety element that we can have to make bicyclists safer. Okay, now that's crossings. We're going to move into sidewalks, which is really the meat and potatoes of the pedestrian realm. So a favorite of mine. Xander, go ahead.
Before we leave crossings, we had a question about crossings.
Yeah.
From Wendy. How would leading pedestrian intervals help when cars turn right on red, or if there's another way to do that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So technically, cars that are turning right on red are supposed to stop to pay attention to pedestrians moving. So that is more an issue of those drivers not following traffic rules and regulations. They're supposed to stop and give pedestrians the priority. Generally, there are a lot of places that advocate against having right on red for that exact reason, that it takes away the time that pedestrians could be crossing, especially if you have pedestrian scrambles where all the pedestrians are going at once. Having turning vehicles really adds to the chaos. So that is a really good question, because it points to an ongoing problem of what happens when you have really great rules in place and you still have issues. I would say that a lot of the solution to that is having better road design. If we keep thinking about ways to design our streets so that drivers have to slow their behavior because it makes sense for them, and because they are reminded that there are so many other people who are using the street, that is possibly the best thing that we can do to improve street safety. Honestly, the part of the problem is that usually drivers are looking out for their safety, which means that they're mainly looking out for other cars, because cars are the major threat to other drivers as well. So yeah, road design is really important for thinking about ways that we can change people's behavior implicitly, as opposed to punishing individual behavior choices. Okay, so that was a really great question. So let's talk about sidewalks. What makes a good sidewalk? One that's wide, that is smooth and level, that has a verge, some sort of buffer between it and where moving vehicles are. Keeping it unobstructed. I have some images later that really annoy me, but I love that I have them because they really point to a major issue for pedestrians is having obstructed sidewalks. And again, you want to have an uninterrupted network, which means that sidewalks connect to crosswalks, connect to other sidewalks. The sidewalk doesn't just come to an abrupt end and leave you stranded. This is the image or the series of images I was talking about. These are all things that I've seen just walking. Some of them I can move around because I am able-bodied and can wait to dodge traffic if I need to. Having passable sidewalks is a massive accessibility concern, because if you are using a wheelchair, if you can't get around this pole that was built permanently in the middle of a sidewalk, you can't safely use the sidewalk. The sidewalk might as well not exist for you. And what's frustrating about this is that it happens to sidewalks, it happens to bike lanes, but it would never happen in a driving lane. You would never see a pole built in the middle of a driving lane the way that you do with sidewalks. Another thing that I like to say is limiting curb cuts where we can. So often you'll go to a mall or a big grocery store that has a big parking lot, and they have so many driveways for cars to come out of. And what that does is create more places where there's an opportunity for a collision between bicyclists or pedestrians and a car. So if you limit the number of driveways and interruptions to the sidewalk, you're limiting the number of places where those collisions can occur. Bike lanes. There are a number of things that we can do, some of which are marginally helpful, some of which are really much, much better and preferred for bicyclists. There's a whole spectrum of things that we can do to make bike lanes. The things that you do with a bucket of paint are the cheapest and the fastest to get done. But as we think about bicyclist safety and wanting to build infrastructure to make mode shift permanently possible, we want to have these more formal sort of concrete buffers and protected bike lanes. Sharrows are the arrows that you see on a driving lane that are just those two arrows like this, that have a bicycle underneath the two arrows. And essentially what it's saying to drivers is don't forget to share the road, but it doesn't really do very much for bicyclist safety, except for that vague reminder to drivers. Of course, having a designated bike lane and one that is protected is far better than just painting a reminder on the driving lane. And same issue that I talked about with sidewalks. The number of times that you will bike and see vehicles parked in the bike lane because it's seen as a additional parking lane or a double parking lane is really dangerous for bicyclists, because it means that they often have to go into a driving lane where they are at greater risk. And then the last part of this that I want to talk about is streetscape elements, which are really the things that for me bring in the idea of public space into the street. So first I want to start with bus stops. Having a shelter at a bus stop is really important to protect people from the elements, including high heat, but also rain and snow. Having seating is not only important for accessibility, but also, it's just important to have a place where people can rest as they wait. Even if they're not waiting for the bus, just having benches around is always a good thing to do. Again, having bike parking so that people can leave their bikes, they can make those intermodal connections is great. Having wayfinding signage so that people know where they're going, where they can go from the bus stop that they're at. And then last, having night lighting. Really important for people to be able to feel safe, but also to be able to see what's going on around them so that they can see the bus coming, so they can see if there's someone else at the bus stop. All those little things that make us more comfortable. A few other age and disability friendly elements is having signage that's really clear and visible to help orient people, having seating so that people have a chance to rest when they need to, and then having shade, whether that's through planting trees or just having awnings or some other form of heat protecting device. I threw this one in for folks that are interested in light pollution, because night lighting is so important, but actually the type of lamp that we choose is also important in terms of the amount of light that it emanates in places that we don't want light, like having more light pollution, not only because it affects people as they're trying to sleep at night, but also because it does affect birds and other animals too, to have that kind of ongoing light. And then trees, one of my favorite things. They're so great on a street setting because, trees are always great, but on a street, they help shade and provide cooling on a hot day. There's nothing better than walking on a shady street in the heat of a DC summer. They also help with climate issues like filtering stormwater. And importantly, they're also a barrier between moving traffic and where people are walking and spending time. It's just a nice buffer to have. But this is also an equity issue. I found a series of maps of Richmond that show race in the top row and then green space, impervious surfaces, and canopy cover on the bottom. You see how directly the legacy of segregation and of redlining plays a role in which communities are now left hotter, which ones are left more prone to flooding, and also to a lack of green space and place for recreation. I also wanted to throw in public bathrooms because this is something that is really important to have in public space that we don't talk about very much. Having clean and accessible bathrooms readily available at all times of day and night is really important for all people to be able to equitably be able to use public space. So having bathrooms that are also big enough that people can take in their mobility devices is important, or take in strollers if they need to. It's just something that we don't have very much, and it really degrades public life in a way that that we don't feel until you really need to pee and you're out in public and you basically have to go home or have to pay for something in a cafe that you didn't want to pay for. Does anywhere in America have public bathrooms? There are public bathrooms every now and then. There's one in Malcolm X Park here in DC. I know a few public bathrooms in the parks and public spaces that I like to go to in various cities, but it's not frequent, it's not reliable. A lot of them close at night. So no, it's not really something that we have, but we desperately need it. And then better land use. So again, this is why this conversation is not just about switching to EVs. It's not just about using our bikes and and walking every now and then, but still heavily relying on cars. This is the way that we have chosen to use public space over decades, where the red is parking. This is Kansas City, Missouri, because this is the best image that I could find, but it's not unique. This is most cities in the US. When we use our downtown public space for parking, it takes away so many of the other uses that we could have, and places that we could have recreation, that we could have activity, we could have housing. Most cities have parking minimums when you're doing new construction, which means that if you are developing housing or you're building a new business that is customer facing, there's a minimum threshold of parking spots that you need to have. Usually it's quite high. And what that does is make it so that a lot of our public space goes to parking, but also places that cannot afford land in the middle of the city because they have to lose so much of it to parking, which is actually quite expensive to build, by the way. Those uses move outside the city. So you see in a lot of cities, actually, libraries moving to the outskirts of cities, senior centers moving to the outskirts of cities because land is so expensive and you're losing so much of it to parking. When you do that, you make it so that people can't walk to the library. You make it so that older people are isolated if they're living in senior centers because they can't walk to everyday destinations. So changing our land use policies and parking minimums especially is one way that we can really change the urban fabric of our towns and our cities so that we can use them better. And when we take that space back, we can use it for a lot of other things, right? Like this is the same argument as taking that public space back. We can use it for storm management to build bioswales, which are absorbing stormwater. We can use it to have little informal hangout spaces or cafes, any number of things. And you see where like this bioswale is a permanent change. This parking spot is a temporary change. We can do any magnitude of things. And as you're advocating in your community, you can think about the small kind of demonstration activities that you can do to show people what's possible that then leads to bigger systematic change. I think a lot of people's opinions on the need for access driving lanes and parking lanes on streets really changed when they started experiencing outdoor dining and they saw how much it did to have that space back. So doing demonstration projects like this parking day project help change opinions because people see what they're winning as opposed to what they're losing. And so as we get to the end of me talking, I want to quickly just talk about a few different things that you could do to take some of these ideas that I've just talked about that are quick and easy, low cost, and then some of the things that are kind of medium cost and higher cost, so you get a sense of what you could be advocating for at different levels. Amongst the low cost things, having these in-street pedestrian signs, advanced yield signs, so like signs earlier on telling cars they need to yield to pedestrians, painting things like the curb cuts, making them, or the curb radii, making them tighter, painting bike lanes, striping on the side, anything like that that is just a few buckets of paint. Those are the cheapest things that you can do, and you can do relatively easily and fast. In the medium cost range is things like trees, planters, these things, flex posts, which are providing some level of safety, but cars can technically drive over them. So they're not the best, but they're better than not having anything there. That's in the medium cost range, which is, by low cost, I mean under $500, by the way, I should say that. And the medium cost is between 500 to 1,000. Fog lines is the white lines on the edge of a street. Sometimes you'll see them painted like right by the curb. Basically, the reason they're called fog lines is because if you're driving in fog, you can see the white line to know where the edge of the road is. So it's just painting one white line that tells you what the edge of the lane is. And it's a similar purpose to it essentially for our purposes, it's narrowing the lane to what we wanted to do. This would be for like one street or one block. So if you were doing a demonstration project, for example, you would probably be doing it for a very short space, and you would be doing it for about a block or so to just show what is possible. So it's cheap in that sense. And also cost really, the reason that I'm not saying $500 so much as low cost is because costs really vary from region to region. And sometimes, putting in a curb is extremely expensive, and other times it's not so expensive. It just depends on who's in charge of it, what they're already doing, and whether it's part of an ongoing project, for example. And then on the high end of the spectrum, so what would be typically over $1,000 for a block or so would be putting in speed bumps and raised crossings. So that would be per raised crossing or per speed bump. Buffers between the roadway and bike and pedestrian lanes that are built out of concrete. So like this one over here, that is a verge or could be a bioswales to absorb stormwater. And then permanently narrowing the roadway by pushing out the sidewalk or doing something else that puts that, again, it's using concrete and not just a bucket of paint. And same with tightening the curb radius. It's building it out permanently and not just with paint. So that was me doing a whole lot of talking, but the main takeaways that I want you to know are that, one, mobility justice is more than safety. It's about building the kinds of places where people can easily and reliably and joyfully use public space to get around in a way that makes sense to them and that is inviting to them. I also want you to focus on changing systems and not personal behaviors. I think there's a lot of emphasis sometimes on traffic enforcement and fines and punitive action for drivers. That may be marginally useful, but it's nowhere as useful as just changing the road design so that people are doing the safer thing. Also, change can be slow. can be expensive, it can be hard to get done, but as we're thinking about the changes that we want to advocate for in our communities, there are quicker, cheaper options available that do work and that can show people what the vision is and what their community could look like so that they also get excited and get on board with making these changes. And then last, showing up and demanding change is a great way to get things done. It's one of the best ways to do it. It's just to be present and be a voice advocating for something when no one else is talking about it. But if you can do it in solidarity with existing community leaders, existing community groups that are doing that work, that is the best way to do it, because you're not only working in solidarity with them, but you're also building on existing capacity to get the work done. So I would now like to take a break from all of you hearing my voice and talk a little bit about you, your neighborhoods, and what you see.